we're going to go ahead and get started tonight with Dr. Silverman, and we are going to start talking about this great topic about visual spatial learners. So just a quick note about Dr. Silverman. She is a licensed psychologist, and she's the founder and director of the Gifted Development Center in Westminster here in Colorado. We're so fortunate to have Linda here in our state as a resource and an advocate for gifted education. So much of my research as a gifted specialist in the state of Colorado hinged on a lot of what Dr. Silverman has produced and put out for all of us gifted individuals to kind of glean off of. And I'm so thankful that she was able to come and join us tonight. She has produced over 300 publications in over 50 years, actually since 1961, over 50 years of working gifted ed. And she's developed the construct of visual-spatial learner, as described in her book, Upside Down Brilliance, which we will highlight later in the presentation, but check it out for sure. So Linda, we are so happy to have you here tonight. And I kind of want to just turn it over to you and let you roll with it this evening.
Well, thank you, Miranda. I love being here. I helped to start CAGT, and so it's very dear to my heart, and I'm always happy to be of service. So I'd like to get started. If you can get my screen share to be activated, and then they can see my slides.
I think they could all see it right now, Linda. I'm looking at our live stream and it is visible.
Wonderful. Okay, then I'm just going to get started. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to talk about some other things first before I actually talk about who are the visual spatial learners, because there's a bigger construct here, a bigger concept that I want to share with you. We have never been here before. We are suspended between two worldviews, two paradigms, the past and the future. If we cling to what we have always done in the past, we will perish. If we let go of the past and plunge into the unknown, we could also perish. Or we could create a new sustainable world. These two worldviews are in all of us, and they are in conflict. I've incorporated material from The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist, an important book about how the imbalance of our hemispheres shapes societal values. I was excited to read this book because it provides empirical support for an epiphany that I had in 1982. I was listening to a tape from brain researcher Jerry Leedy, and I grasped the profound importance of the right hemisphere. 20 years later, I wrote Upside Down Brilliance, the Visual Spatial Learner, and Jerry was kind enough to edit the parts about the brain. She said, we have two minds. Ian goes further, asserting that the right hemisphere is the master and the left hemisphere, the emissary, who usurped its power. So which mind do I want to use today? Jerry said both sides of the brain are fully human organs of thought, each with special processes and abilities. Our left hemisphere deftly labels, records, categorizes, and prioritizes our experiences. Our right hemisphere is designed to grasp a greater reality beyond our individual experiences. And this is the statement that was my great epiphany that led to writing Upside Down Brilliance. The right hemisphere, Jerry said, is encompassing the whole world. That's what we're going to be talking about first. Our right hemisphere allows us to adapt to new circumstances. It's open to new experience. Based on years of research with individuals who've suffered right hemispheric strokes, we now know that our left hemisphere does not know that the right hemisphere exists. It's an island of separateness. It specializes in denial. It denies the existence of anything it cannot analyze and control. Our left hemisphere predicts the future based on the past. It creates rules to sustain and reproduce our own. Its main concern is utility. It creates bureaucracies, hierarchies, competitions. It is always a winner. It likes habits and it's uncomfortable with change. Our right hemisphere, however, is very aware that it shares the brain with another mind. It communicates with our left hemisphere through dreams, imagination, visions, intuitions, knowingness. It does not speak. For thousands of years, we mistakenly thought it was dumb. Being without speech does not mean being without intelligence. Our right hemisphere appreciates individuality and uniqueness. However, it is aware of more than our individual selves. It is our connection with others. It's the source of our empathy. It recognizes our interdependence. It sees each thing in its relationship with all that surrounds it. It's the fountain of our openness to experience. It embraces the unknown. It's connected to all that is. Our left hemisphere has dominated our lives for so long that we have nearly forgotten that we have a right hemisphere. Education, like all our other bureaucracies, has become the emissary of the left hemisphere, inculcating the known. It does not prepare us for dealing with the unknown. Do we educate our children to reproduce what is, or encourage them to create a new reality? Today, we see the structures and beliefs wrought by the left hemisphere crumbling in the face of new challenges. We are poised on the brink of a new world. Are we brave enough to usher it in? Or are we compelled to recreate what we have done in the past, clinging to the false hope that what is familiar is safe? Only our right hemisphere can lead us out of the known into the unknown. Our right hemisphere is our voyager to new ways of being in the world. Visual-spatial learners lead with their right hemisphere. Some are right hemispheric because their left hemispheres are disabled, which gives them more access to the right side of the brain. Some with intact left hemispheres favor their right as the source of their joy. It seems that more and more children are being born with powerful right hemispheres. The clash of worldviews between the two hemispheres is confusing to the child. The left hemisphere values fitting in, being like everyone else, following the rules, competing to win, forsaking the now to achieve other people's goals. The right hemisphere values uniqueness, being true to oneself, finding one's own path, thinking outside the box, appreciating everyone as an individual rather than seeing each person as a competitor, being absorbed in the now. It's understandable why children resist the values of the left hemisphere. Now that students have experienced education at home, they are even more reluctant to give up their individuality to conform to group norms. From a right hemispheric perspective, education needs to adapt to the individual instead of the other way around. In a computer age, this is very feasible. We need to be asking different questions. How does this child learn best? What is this child interested in? What does this child want to know? What brings a particular child joy? Children with wonderful right hemispheres love images. They have imaginations that are very real to them. They're big picture thinkers. They need to see the whole to understand the parts. They're usually empathic, if not with people, at least with animals. They do not compartmentalize their emotions. They can only learn with teachers who like them. They're highly intuitive. They know things without being able to explain how they know what they know. Many visual spatial learners are born builders, are Lego maniacs. Many love puzzles. Many are artistic or designers or musical. They gravitate to all the fine arts, music, theater, dance, you name it. Some have a natural affinity for numbers, even if they can't memorize their math facts. Some are future engineers, scientists, and surgeons. Upside Down Brilliance is filled with cartoons that were drawn by Buck Jones. Are you more like the lady on the left or the man on the right? She's a filer, he's a piler. If you're a filer, please do not organize the piles in your visual spatial learners' lives. They will never be able to find anything again. How many of these traits fit you? Are you a big picture thinker? Do you solve problems in unusual ways? Do you learn concepts all at once, that great big aha? Do you need to see relationships to learn? Do you have a vivid imagination? Can you feel what others are feeling? Are you good at reading maps? Do you often lose track of time? Do you struggle with spelling? Are you organizationally impaired? In Upside Down Brilliance, I propose that there are two ways of knowing, auditory-sequential and visual-spatial. You already do an excellent job teaching auditory-sequential learners. These happy faces love school. You simply need to add strategies for teaching visual-spatial learners, which activate the right hemispheres of the entire class. VSLs need to see the whole, and then they see how the parts fit. They don't learn in a step-by-step fashion. Keen observers, they may not grasp what they hear. They see the big picture, but they may miss details. They learn all at once rather than trial and error. Their learning is stored in images and feelings rather than in words and ideas. They come up with unusual solutions to problems instead of shooting for one right answer. They often lose track of time, whereas auditory sequentials are time conscious. They're intuitive rather than analytical. So who are our visual spatial learners? Twice exceptional learners, underachievers, culturally diverse students, at least some of them, creative learners, artists, musicians, mathematicians, builders. And what will become of these children when they're adults? Some will become surgeons, mathematicians, photographers, architects, pilots, city planners, and designers. To become a surgeon, doctors have to take spatial exams. You want your surgeon to know where everything in your body is so that he or she can put it back exactly where it belongs. How can we tell if our students are visual spatial? Is easy hard and hard easy? You mean to tell me that you can solve this complex math problem, but you can't tell me what day follows Tuesday? They remember what they see, but they forget what they hear. Do they come up with the most clever reasons for not having their homework that you've ever heard? Some deserve extra credit for these performances. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't have my homework done, and let me tell you why. We've done quite a bit of research on visual spatial learners that began in the 1990s. We wanted to find out how many visual spatial learners there were. So we developed a visual spatial identifier and validated it in schools in Colorado, in Fort Morgan, and in Jefferson County. We learned that over 60% of the students in the regular classroom show at least a slight preference for visual spatial learning. And over a third of them showed a strong preference. We studied 750 4th through 6th graders, white and Hispanic, urban and rural, all socioeconomic levels, all IQ ranges. We found higher percentages of VSLs among the Navajo, in gifted groups, and in twice exceptional populations. In a study at a school for twice exceptional children in California, 87% were visual spatial learners. So how can classrooms serve visual spatial learners? Some model builders never read the directions. I would never be able to put together a model plane without step-by-step instructions. That's why you need different strategies for different types of learners. What turns on the right hemisphere? Jerry Levy said laughter, novelty, emotion, stories, fantasy, beauty, music, and images. The word image refers to all the senses: smells, taste, sound, touch, movement, balance, place in space, and sense of emotions and feeling. Images create reality. Everything begins with an idea or a picture. So use visual aids. They respond to visual, they do not respond to lecture or to too much talk. Present information visually and use images to anchor ideas. VSLs remember what they see and forget what they hear. Use visualization techniques. For example, have them picture words that they're trying to learn to spell and ask them to spell them backward. It's a great magic trick for poor spellers. If they can make a good mental picture of the word, they can read the letters in either direction. As you present a topic, ask your students to close their eyes and picture ideas in their mind's eye. A picture is worth 1,000 words. If you can see it in your mind's eye, it's yours forever. Ask students to tell you about their pictures. Some of you may recognize the Druidon Dragon. Druidon is a science fantasy creative writing mentoring program where budding science fantasy writers can get their work published. Creative Writing Solutions is a website where teachers can learn how to use fantasy to get reluctant writers to write. Give them the big picture first. They're not step-by-step learners. How important is intuition? Has intuition ever saved your life or the life of someone you know? Then how come we don't honor it at school? How do you know that is a left hemispheric device for belittling your inner knowing? Visual spatial learners are a treasure trove of intuitive power, which needs to be celebrated and mobilized as a legitimate source of information. Instead of show your work, ask children, what does your intuition tell you? You will be astounded at the depth of their wisdom. Children should hear, trust your intuition every day. The computer must have been invented by a visual spatial learner since it's a perfect match to the way they learn. It presents information visually. It has all the time in the world. It knows which direction all the letters go. It uses capital letters, so you never mix up B, D, P, and Q, and it automatically corrects your spelling. Teach keyboarding skills. When you touch type, you use both hands, which integrates information from both hemispheres. If children can't learn to keyboard after a year of trying, try voice-to-text programs like Dragon Naturally Speaking. Just know that it takes a while to train your dragon to recognize your voice. Movement is essential to learning. Music, put it to music. Music is processed in the right hemisphere. Use color. Is whole word better or is phonics better? Jerry Levy said for most children, phonics is better, but for some children, whole word is better. There is no ideal method because there's no ideal brain. Diversity is probably what makes a social species possible. Some children need to sound out words to remember them, while others need to visualize the word and its referent. Phonics is a left hemispheric skill. Involve hands-on experiences. They learn through active involvement. Use discovery techniques. Visual-spatial learners are superb pattern finders. Allow students to construct, draw, or create visual representations of concepts to process information and to demonstrate mastery. Give them more time. Visual-spatial children live in a time warp. It takes more time for image thinkers to translate their pictures into words. They're handicapped on time tests such as Mad Minutes. Time only exists in your left hemisphere. When you hang out in your right hemisphere, it feels like you've stepped outside of time. Play, fun, joy are all timeless. Give them credit for correct answers even when they don't show their work. They may have seen the solution in their mind's eye without taking any steps. Show your work is a left hemispheric dictate. It does not fit the way VSLs learn. Grade them separately for content and mechanics. I learned from Jerry Levy that challenge integrates the two hemispheres. If something is too easy, often the right hemisphere doesn't get involved. But when it increases in difficulty, all hands are on deck and the right hemisphere comes to the rescue. Gifted visual spatial learners, especially twice exceptional learners, are wired to deal with complexity. Many times the easier work is sequential and involves rote memorization. They need more complexity to learn. Bring the fine arts back into education. Art is the sanctuary, the emotional healer, the integration of the senses, the secret to understanding, the pathway to success for the visual spatial learner. The time is now. For 5,000 years, we have been educating the left hemisphere. We know how to do this well. It's time to learn how to educate the silent partner, the right hemisphere. Since all students have right hemispheres, all students benefit from the strategies developed for engaging right hemispheric learners. Jerry Levy said that unless the right hemisphere is activated and engaged, attention is low and learning is poor. This is true for all students, all learners. If you want somebody to learn, you have to activate their right hemisphere because that's where their attention comes from. We've prized left hemispheric skills for thousands of years, but right hemispheric skills are becoming critical to success in the 21st century. Schools must prepare students for the visually oriented, creative careers that await them. Visual spatial learners will become the next generation of leaders. Who knows? In time, we may have to read about sequential learning since visual spatial learning may become the norm. Equality is giving everyone a shoe. Equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits. Everyone deserves an equal opportunity to be successful. Children do not all learn the same way. To be equitable means providing every student with an education that matches the way that student learns. But this goes well beyond learning styles. Our survival depends upon our inviting our right hemisphere to lead us into the unknown so that we can create a new, kinder, equitable, sustainable future. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Linda. We're gonna leave your contact information up for just a minute before we stop sharing your screen so that people who want to learn more about the Gifted Development Center can jot your contact info down right now. We have people from all over the world joining us tonight, Linda. I know you can't see the comments, but we have people from Sweden and Australia and California, and I think I saw Ohio. So we have just got a wide range of people watching tonight. We're so happy that they were able to join us. Some of them are even up at 1 a.m. to watch your presentation.
I just want to share that at the very bottom is the URL for finding free teaching strategies on our website. Guidelines Teaching Visual Spatial Learners, VSLs. There's a lot of articles on the website. They're all free downloads.
Oh, that's wonderful. So teachers, if you're watching, check that out. I think that some of the strategies she talked about, she went over so many tonight, and I'm gonna have to unpack those myself. But knowing that we can access them on her website is awesome. Awesome. Oh, we got Marion from Holland. So in Argentina, look at that. All over the world, Linda. That's terrific. So we do have a couple questions that have come in, and I'm going to go ahead and start asking them now. So if you're watching, please feel free to jump in and ask your questions. We will monitor the chat for further questions, but I have a couple that came in while we were while Linda was presenting, and a couple that we got previous to her presentation from a survey we sent out to our members. So if you're ready, Linda, we'll jump right in.
I'm ready.
Okay. So Carlotta from Boulder Valley Schools here in Colorado asks, why doesn't curriculum development reflect the research on neurodiversity to provide adequate and effective professional development, resources, and instruction to allow visual spatial students to better succeed in school?
I wish I knew the answer to that, Carlotta. I'm with you. They need to be doing that. It might be because there have been some bad press about learning styles and about the left and right hemisphere over the past several years, and people don't realize how important the right hemisphere really is. This is just starting to become understood. The master and his emissary is changing all of our viewpoints about the right hemisphere. So I think some of the information is just new and it hasn't gotten to curriculum and instruction developers yet.
Well, let's fingers crossed we catch on quickly, huh? And get change coming. Her other question, Carlotta had two questions. She said, with the current focus on STEM education, is there an urgency to revamp or restructure schools in order to capitalize on students' advanced visual spatial skills and potential?
Yes, I think that visual spatial and STEM overlap, but not all visual spatial learners are STEM students. Some of them have very deep empathy. They love nature. They are very spiritually oriented, and they may not have any interest at all in STEM. So STEM is very good for some visual spatial learners, but not for all of them.
Yeah, just because you're good at Legos doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be, you're a Lego master. Doesn't necessarily mean STEM is where you go.
Right.
We don't want to make assumptions about things, but yes. There is another question from Kelly. Actually, Kelly has two questions. I jotted one down from earlier. What suggestion do you have to support VSLs during this period of online and remote learning? And I know you touched on some of the strategies, but if you could pick out a couple that might support her, like for example, teaching math concepts without access to hands-on materials.
I have an article that you can download from our website. It's called Teaching Mathematics to Non-Sequential Learners. And it's a way of teaching kids their math facts in 8 days with no memorization.
Wow.
There's some drawing involved. They draw their favorite things. They have to have an investment in maybe 8 different favorite things. Let's say they like chocolate chip cookies and they can't remember 6 times 8, or which is also 8 times 6. It's the same fact. Mm-hmm. They would draw a picture of 8 cookies with 6 chocolate chips, or 6 cookies with 8 chocolate chips, and they'd count up all those chocolate chips and put 8 times 6 at the top and 6 times 8 at the bottom. And then they would put the answer and their drawing up over their bed. And they would look at it until 6 times 8 becomes cookies to them.
Mm-hmm.
And they have the visual image of the chocolate chip cookies that will help them to remember that fact. So there's a lot of ideas in the handouts on the website that you can use at home and you can use during COVID-19. The most important thing, I think, is to recognize the individuality of the child. And so you try, and I think this is something the parents have to do with you. You try to find out, what is this child excited about? What lights this child's lights? And then you design virtual education to go with that individualization of the program for the child.
Okay, thank you. I think that's great advice. And I think, I think we're all struggling with this online learning, especially us teachers who've been teaching in person. And I think transitioning to that and also keeping in mind that how many of our kids are visual spatial learners, I think we need as much support as we can get. Myra, I hope I pronounced that right, asked, so teaching reading one way, like with the phonics and decoding, is, she puts in quotes, an old world view. And I know you do mention some of that stuff in your presentation later on about the phonics. Can you reiterate to her about what you kind of meant by the distinction between the visual learner learning like what the image of the word looks like versus the phonetic pronunciation of the word, and how we can maybe strategize to support visual spatial learners better?
Visual spatial learners learn holistically. And the part of their brain that is accessing phonemes, that's the left hemisphere, is not as strong as the part of their brain that accesses images. So they do better by collecting a lot of visually based words like mountain and forest and river that they can see. And this method was described by Sylvia Ashton Warner in Teacher. And there's a lot of similar types of programs that give the child an enormous number of visualizing words that they can actually see in their mind's eye before introducing phonics.
That's great. I'm sorry, I'm trying to monitor all the questions. We have a lot of questions coming in, Linda, a lot of them. We had another question from Lisa. She asked, can Linda speak to spirituality in VSLs?
Yes, I can.
Probably another lecture, right?
No, it's not another lecture. It's this lecture.
Awesome.
I've been a little nervous about using the term spirituality because of the separation of church and state, and not wanting to impose my own spiritual views, which I think might turn off some people who would be all excited about this, and yet they are not spiritually oriented themselves. But if you really read between the lines of what I said, I am talking about spirituality. It is the right hemisphere that's connected to all that is and can lead us out of just recreating what we know, and would have trust that you can move out of the known because you're really not alone. We're all protected. We're all embraced. And so my spirituality is a very powerful part of my philosophy of teaching. And the visual spatial learner grew out of my awareness, my spiritual awareness. When I heard Jerry Levy on that tape say that the right hemisphere is aware of everything in the world, I saw the right hemisphere having access to our spirituality, access to the cosmos, access to more than we could possibly understand with just our minds. And where I got real support on that was in the book, My Stroke of Insight by Jill Bolte Taylor. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And she has a terrific TED Talk. I probably watched it 50 times, and I get something new out of it each time. But whoever asked about spirituality, please watch Jill Bolte Taylor's TED Talk. It's dynamite, and it's going to give you a lot of the information you're looking for.
And that was Lisa that asked that question. So Lisa, if you're still on here listening, check out that TED Talk.
Visual-spatial learners are and tend to be pretty spiritual people.
So, and that makes sense. I think that just makes sense with what you've shared with us today. Kelly asked, you mentioned the hemispheres of the brain working together when the appropriate level of challenge is offered.
Yes.
And you mentioned how engagement is so essential to engage both sides when we want students to be challenged and engaged in their learning. How does this fit into how underachievers navigate a learning environment?
It's the same thing. What I've discovered in working with underachievers is they too, if they're gifted underachievers, need complexity. And I remember Sylvia Rim writing, I think it was a footnote in a chapter that she wrote about how she accelerates underachievers instead of holding them back, and they do better. I've often taken underachievers on trips to colleges to see whether they relate to a college atmosphere, maybe encourage them to audit a course with a teacher that they really respond to, just the description of that teacher on internet. Or maybe it's a teacher that allows them to sit in on the class. If we can get them excited about learning beyond K through 12 learning, they're more willing to do what it takes to get into a college environment. And I know some of you are going to be upset with this, but I often take kids out of high schools that do not work, that undermine their confidence, that belittle them and make them feel stupid, and tell them to get a GED and go to college.
And you know, actually, honestly, Linda, I think when you see the number of students who drop out who are gifted, and then do go on to get their GED and go to college, and also students who feel like, especially when we look at younger kids, first and second graders, who've already kind of figured out the system and say, you know what, this isn't it for me. They're not paying attention to how I learn. I know I could do more than this, but I'm checking out. Like, this game of school is not for me. And then we start underachievement really young. And I think you have a really great point, is that holding them back is not going to fix the underachievement. They are underachieving. So let's put them in a situation where they can achieve, you know, at a higher level. It's great.
They need complexity. They need meaning.
Mm-hmm.
They need their learning to be meaningful. And underachievers, I've found, are very interested in the fine arts. And if you can get them involved in one of the arts, they will often show you great passion for learning.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Music and theater and art. Like you said, we can't get rid of those. Those need to stay in our schools. Is very important.
You bet.
We be talking about possible, you know, underachievement, but maybe kids that appear to maybe be struggling. Katie Bond says her son teacher will not advance in math because he struggles to show his work. And you mentioned the showing the work in your slide. Do you have suggestions for how to give him the complexity he needs with that while he's being held back? So
another teacher.
Another teacher.
Yeah. I think if a teacher really believes that showing your work, being able to do things in a timed fashion is what math is all about, that's not the right math teacher for your kid. I was a math teacher. I developed the only course on elementary math for the gifted that was a required course for anyone getting a master's in gifted education at the University of Denver, because I didn't feel that teachers had the right to remain math phobic and still be teachers of the gifted. They needed to clean up their act.
Mhm.
I found that my students in that course divided into two groups, mathaholic and mathophobic, nothing in between. There were no math neutral students ever. So if you've got mathophobic teachers, the only thing they know how to do is train calculators. If a calculator can do it, it's not gifted curriculum. It's not what visual spatial learners do best. They do best with geometry, with physics, with calculus, with Boolean algebra, with trigonometry, with advanced math. And if some teacher, like that teacher, hasn't completely destroyed their belief in themselves as a mathematical human being, so that they drop out of school before they ever get to the good stuff, they're in danger. They're really in danger of losing their love of mathematics by having those kinds of teachers. They need to be protected from teachers who hold them back because they won't show their work. That is left hemispheric domination. And that teacher needs to either learn about visual spatial learners, or you have to take the child away from a toxic environment.
Well, thank you, Linda. I appreciate your candor. I do. I think I have had a lot of parents struggle with my kid knows it, but won't show his work. I also have a son who struggles to show his work, but can do complex mathematics in his head, and struggles to show his work and loses points because of that, because he's not showing his work. And I try to explain to him, there's definitely a time when you're going to have to show your work. You can't prove a theorem without showing your work, but sometimes 5 + 5 or 5 × 5, when you know it, you know it. So I appreciate the advice, and I hope that helped, Katie. That response helped your understanding of what you could do for your kiddo. We have so many questions. I've got another one from Mark Halpert. I hope I pronounced that right.
Hi, Mark.
Psychologists have challenged the concept that visual spatial learners are more likely to have visual processing issues. Could you share your insights on this issue and how addressing the visual processing challenge can help these students succeed?
Okay. If this is the same Mark, they have 3D learner systems in Boca Raton, Florida. And it's a wonderful, wonderful center. The hardest visual spatial learner to be able to identify is the one who has visual processing challenges, because their visual process, how they learn, is by visualizing. But if their eyes aren't working together, if their eyes aren't teaming, they're often losing important peripheral information. I've been working very closely with an optometrist in California named Dr. Kageyama, and he's taken quite an interest in the gifted. And he says that the majority of the kids that he's working with, who are sent to him as gifted kids who are applying for schools for the gifted, are visual spatial learners who have lost their peripheral vision. Wow. Because when they were little, they saw double. And the way they learned to stop seeing double was to just look at one eye and omit the peripheral vision, because it was the second image was in the periphery. Wow. So you need that peripheral vision to fully access your visual spatial abilities. I think a lot of kids need vision therapy and would benefit from vision therapy.
Wow.
When you've got a visual spatial learner who hates puzzles, that's a kid who should be seeing an optometrist. because most visual spatial kids love puzzles. But visual spatial kids with visual deficiencies can't figure them out.
Oh, I could only imagine. That's a very interesting research that's being done. That's very interesting. You know, and actually on that same note, we had a follow-up question right below Mark's that was about auditory processing disorders. So she said, to what extent do deficiencies in the left hemisphere lead to VSL? So such as like auditory processing disorders, dyslexia, which her 3 VSL learners have.
Well, that is a complicated question because some people think visual spatial learner is a disability, and it's not. But it can live with other issues. So there are visual spatial learners who are highly gifted. They have incredible left hemispheres as well as right hemispheres. They integrate information between those 2 hemispheres beautifully. They have no auditory processing difficulties whatsoever. But then there are visual spatial learners who have auditory processing deficiencies. And that group struggle. They tend to be underachievers. And it's not that the visual spatial learner causes the auditory processing problem, but sometimes if a child in early childhood, in the toddler years, let's say the child has multiple chronic ear infections. If you put your hands over your ears and try to listen to what I'm saying, you really have to read my lips and look at my face to understand me. So if a child's had a lot of ear infections, that auditory processing difficulty can lead you to develop more of your visual spatial right hemispheric circuits. So it's possible that ear infections can lead to both the auditory processing problem and the visual spatial learning style.
That's it. Very interesting. That's very interesting. I think I've noticed that especially now how much I rely on seeing people's lips when they talk because everybody has a mask on.
Yes, and I just heard that they have masks that you can see through for deaf people,
Like
and I'm thinking of trying to get those for our testers. I think that would be marvelous.
Oh, that's a
So,
good point.
the main reason people become visual spatial is because they have a parent who's visual spatial. That's the main number one reason why we see visual spatial kids. One or the other parent or both are visual spatial learners themselves.
That's interesting. There's so much research around what you've been doing. We have, oh my gosh, I'm having a hard time keeping up with comments. You have stimulated some great conversation. There seems to be, Emily Stone says there seems to be a lot of focus on kids having lots of outputs as a way of showing their mastery to like, how do you show mastery? You produce, right? But for VSLs, sometimes they get the concept internally, but it takes a long time for them to pump out the written content. So any thoughts on how we can encourage teachers to assess for mastery in a different way that's maybe a little less output heavy?
Yes, there's a lot of that information on our website, but you have to allow kids to do photographic essays or to create a cartoon or to do a PowerPoint presentation or to create a map or to do something else visual to show that they've mastered the information. You could also try more oral tests because a lot of visual spatial learners and underachievers and twice exceptional children hate handwriting. And if you gave them oral exams, they could tell you much more than they can write out.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. I think there's definitely kids that verbalize things so much better than they could ever put in writing. I know a good chunk of the students that I work with are the same way. They could talk my ear off about things. And sometimes putting things in like a PowerPoint presentation instead of essay format really helps them get their ideas out so they can have a visual with just a couple bullet points instead of having to
Right.
Okay. I hope that helped Emily answer your question. Oh my goodness gracious. I'm trying to scroll back here to all these questions. I'm so glad this stimulated so much conversation. A high IQ is related with VSLs to be, so somebody's asking a question, they want some clarification on IQ and visual spatial learning. To be VSL means to be an IQ of 150 or more. Is IQ and visual spatial being a VSL, is there any link?
I don't know where the 150 came from, but that's not true. Visual spatial learners are at every level, from the lowest IQ to the highest IQ. I happen to have studied gifted visual spatial learners because I studied giftedness. And so it was in the context of giftedness that I found them. But they're not limited to just the gifted. So it's not about 150 IQ to be VSL. What is true is that children who have 150 IQ, or adults who have a 150 IQ, almost always have very strong right and left hemispheres. They have both. Mm-hmm. They don't fit one side or the other side, they fit both. And they integrate very quickly back and forth between those two hemispheres. That's a function of children in the 150 range. But Norma Heffenstein did a research study at the University of Denver and found that highly gifted children preferred the right hemisphere. They were more holistic learners. And the kids who were moderately gifted tended to be more sequential. She called them simultaneous learners, okay, using the terminology in the KBC. But simultaneity and visual spatial and right hemispheric are all the same.
Okay. Thanks for clearing that up. I think there's some other, just, it's always good to clear up misconceptions and that kind of stuff. I have another question kind of along the same lines about who are the visual spatial learners. Ruth Ann asks, are all children on the autism spectrum visual spatial learners?
Oh boy, I don't think so, but I have so much conflicting information about that I can't give a clear answer. I would guess that Dee Levecki would say no, and she's an expert on gifted children with autism, and she's writing a book on it, Different Minds. She's writing the second edition. But I do know that when I originated the construct of the visual spatial learner, and I put on our website, are you a visual spatial learner? Tell me your stories. I want to hear your stories. I got a lot of stories from children and adults on the spectrum, mostly adults. And so I sort of started to believe that most autistic people were more right hemispheric. But then in The Master and His Emissary, he says exactly the opposite. I don't think he knows what he's talking about autism. But I'm guessing that there are a variety of different types of autistic presentations.
Thank you. I think, yeah, more research needs done on that then. Very interesting. CLO asks, advice for gifted kids with slow processing speed, and practical advice for kids who might struggle with executive functions.
Well, I'm not an executive function expert. So that's not one I want to take on. We only have a few minutes left. Mm-hmm. But slow processing speed is across the board in all gifted populations. It's a matter of degree. If the degree of slow processing speed is greater than the other gifted kids, let me give you some context for this. We've done a great deal of study of IQ scores on the different factors. And in all of our studies, gifted kids have average processing speed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not just our studies.
Yeah.
Studies have been done by many of our colleagues and come up with exactly the same results. So gifted people are not necessarily faster. And processing speed, from my perspective, shouldn't be a part of the measure of intelligence, which is why I developed the gifted index for the WISC-5, which doesn't involve processing speed or working memory.
And that's
However, that being said, if you're a 100 processing speed and you're a 150 intelligence, that's the norm for gifted. But if you're 85 processing speed or you're 60 processing speed, that's a serious processing speed deficit. And I have to go back to my friend, Dr. Kageyama in California. He's written a paper on low visual processing speed syndrome in the gifted. And he believes that it's a visual problem because if you look at what it takes to get a processing speed score, it's visual motor or visual presented items. All processing speed items are presented visually. So vision really does need to be considered as a player when we're trying to figure out what's going on with that particular child. Dr. Kageyama says that if you don't fix the visual processing speed, then eventually it will erode the visual spatial abilities, the fluid reasoning abilities, and even the verbal abstract reasoning abilities. That it's a degenerative process that can be reversed with vision therapy.
That's amazing. I think there's so much, we could probably go on forever, and there are possibly more questions here that I just can't see because there were so many. So we have directed them to reach out to the Gifted Development Center if they have specific questions about their child that they need support with, or about students that they teach. And Joy, huge thanks to Joy for joining the chat tonight and helping with some of the links to your books. We have links to the Upside Down Brilliance in here. We've also linked our website in here so people can watch the presentation later. We just don't have time for all the questions. My goodness, we could probably be on here all night, Linda. So we are gonna wrap up. I think you know, this is probably one of the most interactive presentations we've had on here, and we urge people to watch it again, to contact you on we're having some freezing issues, so luckily we're at the end of our presentation. We do want to encourage everybody to join next Tuesday at 5 o'clock. We'll have Jim Delisle on. I know, we're just having some great conversations with some of the best and brightest in gifted ed, and we're loving this. So please make sure that you join us next week. Again, please contact Linda at the Gifted Development Center. If you have any other questions, refer back to the chat and the comments for links to buy her book and to contact us and her. And we're just so glad to have had you all tonight. But we are going
Upside Down Brilliance is out of print.
Oh.
So we're not selling it, but they can get used copies on Amazon.
Okay, you heard it here, folks. Check Amazon for used copies of Upside Down Brilliant. It's out of print, which might be why someone said they had to pay $100 in Canadian money for it. It's a hot item on the internet there, Linda. Well, you are getting many thanks. Terry Bradley asks if you can come back for a part 2 because there's just so much interest in your chat, and I think that sounds like a wonderful idea.
I'd be delighted.
Awesome. We would love to have you. So we're going to go ahead and sign off now. You have so many thanks. I'm going to send you a transcript of this chat so you can see how many people just love to see you. And we will talk to you soon. Hopefully there'll be a part 2 coming up in the coming months.
Thank you, Miranda. Thank you, Nanette. Thank you to all of you for being part of this.
We are so glad to have you. Thank you again. And thank you everybody for watching. We are going to sign off. Have a great rest of your Tuesday evening.